I assume you would have the board chair on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Would have the board chair absolutely on. And related to this, I'm a huge fan of, at the board meeting, we're going to talk about board meetings later, but I would always have an executive session. Absolutely every board meeting, you boot the executive director, they go and you have a conversation. And I know some people are like, oh man, that's kind of harsh for the executive director. My experience with executive directors is just the opposite. Executive directors are not, they don't get nervous when the board sits down as a group and comes to consensus on something. They get nervous when, after the board meeting, they see 3 people leaning on the pickup truck having a conversation afterwards. That's the stuff that when y'all agree as a group, I can deal with it. But this rump group, that rump group, etc. The other thing that these executive sessions do is then it's like, no, Stacy, we're not having that conversation. Stacy calls up and says, Dale, I've got a question about the executive director. I'm kind of time out. We're not doing that as one-offs. We'll do that at the full board meeting in the executive session. There's one every meeting. And it could be just, let's get some consensus on an attaboy. I think she did a really great job of X, and I want to give an attaboy, but I want everybody else to say, yeah, we agree that was great before I do the attaboy.
When you say executive session, that would be a closed meeting. right?
Closed meeting, executive director is not in the room. I would tend,
Only
No
board
minutes taken?
Well, you can take minutes, but they don't,
they're not going to show up at the board meeting.
Not show up at the board
minutes.
meeting, not going to be in the board
But any
file.
visitors would have to leave. and
Yeah.
They wouldn't be part of the audit, right?
No,
You know, because the audit requires the board.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right.
now, I would, in terms of the audit, I would have the board meet with the auditor sans the executive director.
Absolutely.
And I would have the board, not the executive director, select the auditor. I don't like staff picking the auditor, and I want the board to meet with the auditor sans the executive, sans all staff.
Yeah, you have to do that, otherwise you're not going to have the confidence that the audit is a accurate reflection of what's going on.
The board
Bob, you know
has,
this.
we do pick the auditor,
Okay.
we don't meet with the auditor though.
Yeah, I think you should meet with the
You should
auditor.
meet with the auditor.
Because the auditor needs to have an opportunity to look you dead in the eye and say,
Yeah.
And we
Here-
may have at one point back, did the auditor used to come? Yeah.
But it wasn't a separate meeting, it was he or she making a presentation of financial report to the board.
We ask, is there anything we should know that you did not put in the report? Are there questions we should ask that have not been asked?
So that would be an executive session.
exactly.
Executive session with the person who did the audit.
Now, after the executive session, I think you have a responsibility in a very, very short time frame, which usually means immediately walking down, in this case, to her office and saying, here's what went down. There's no mystery here. And even if you got nothing to talk about, you meet for a little bit, just tell a joke. Nothing keeps the executive director going like everybody laughing as soon as they leave the room. But you immediately give the good feedback that says, here were, here are a couple attaboys, here was a concern, and sometimes it's, here was a concern, and maybe even, hey, can we go back and clear this up with the board now? Or, look, it's not a big deal, but, at the next meeting, let's talk about it, or whatever. But they, in my mind, deserve virtually immediate feedback on what the board said, if anything, that is relevant to the executive director. Again, board chair might be in the room when that happens, but I would have my CEO management chair is probably leading that conversation.
And the other reason to have the exec session on every agenda is that if you only put it on when there's an issue, that makes staff nervous, that makes the executive director nervous. You keep, have it on every agenda and always hold the session. I mean, there may be a time where you're running late and so you say, all right, well, does anybody have anything for the executive session? And you may not do it, but you want it on the agenda.
Yeah.
I want to be able to be clear that executive session is the entire board.
Yes.
But what you're also saying, we now have an hour meeting, we may need to extend that. If we start to get into substantive mission issues and have an executive session, an hour may not be enough,
May not be enough.
And you meet how often?
monthly. 10 months out of 12.
Yeah. I lean to more bi-monthly and
Longer
longer.
meetings by month?
And maybe longer meetings. My concern is that monthly meetings tend to invite more going into operational detail because they're more frequent, et cetera. I would be biased towards, ultimately, and I don't think you ought to do this right away, but ultimately, I think in terms of quarterly meetings.
Yeah, but I think the way, at least what I've seen in organizations do quarterly meetings, they'll do quarterly meetings and then there'll be an odd one or two other meetings
Could well be
that
during the
get-
year.
that get brought in during the year. You're gonna have a separate meeting to do strategic planning review.
And what I would do is, really before you're even thinking about the frequency, is say, okay, what is it we need to get done as a board? So I'd start with your to-do list. And I think exactly where Al's at. We have one meeting a year where we approve the budget. We have one meeting a year where we set strategic direction or review strategic direction. We have one meeting a year where the primary focus of that meeting is executive director feedback and compensation. So I like the concept of there's sort of themes to at least a number of these meetings that are, here's during the course of the year, here's the workload for the board, we gotta get these 4 or 5 things done, well, okay, which meeting are we gonna focus on that?
In fact, we've got a calendar, we have a calendar of.
At the Grand.
At the Grand. Here's what happens at this meeting, here's what happens at this meeting, and then what our executive committee or the CEO management committee, they also have a calendar.
And these are things they need to get done. Yeah, Megan, do you have a question?
Yeah, so like one of the, and this kind of goes back to like the agendas we have today, like one of the things is we have like Joni puts like a 2 to 3 page executive director report together that we all get, and she used to kind of touch on it, now we've gone to really more like an approval, but is that, I mean,
What's in the executive director report?
We do statistics as far as like how many animals were adopted, euthanized, that type of thing. We talk about what kind of fundraisers we might have done, if we've gotten a bequest from anyone. We'll talk about anything that is out of the ordinary from the shelter operations.
And then is
Some
that-
Strategic planning goals.
Is that discussed then at the board meeting?
We changed the agenda a few months ago to read questions and comments rather than Joni going through it again. Same thing for the treasurer's report.
Right.
It's distributed documents, questions and comments.
Good, excellent. I'm a big fan of, this is FYI information, but we don't intend to discuss it.
Not all of it.
You said you approved them?
no, we
No,
don't, no,
Okay,
we
good,
don't do
good,
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And I
you
was
just-
just curious, like, to what extent should she be, because of course, some of those things will prompt questions that maybe they shouldn't, like, maybe there is some operational stuff in there that,
But as soon as you provide the information, it's likely to prompt a question. And one of the things I ask is, what am I gonna do with that piece of information? This was years before I was on the Grand Opera House board, but I was at a Grand Opera House board meeting and they were talking about ticket sales were down for the thing that was going on next week. It's like, yeah? You're really expecting these board members to start, give me a handful of tickets, I'm gonna go stand on the street and sell them? I mean, what am I supposed to do with that piece of information? And if this is a piece of information that,
Joni doesn't get that detail, but I see it as information that allows us to build friends in the community because we can be educated about what's going on. Here's our live release rate, here's what's going on at the shelter,
does the shelter have a newsletter
online, yes.
E-news, yeah.
emails.
that goes to
Anyone that we have email.
the world?
To the world.
Is it, how different is that than your,
That's more fluff. The e-news.
so I'm just like,
Behind the
if
scenes
we have
details,
meetings that are
right?
specifically set for, okay, this we're doing budget, this we're doing strategic planning, but we throw these different, like that, and, and there's just different things that, does that then begin to,
well, yeah, I get nervous about it, and one of the things I keep in my head is that from an executive director perspective, correct me if it's different for you, but I think you're at least a 2-to-1 ratio. For every hour of board or committee meeting, there's 2 hours of executive director time spent before or after the meeting, preparing for or cleaning up after.
yeah, right.
Does that sound, if anything,
Yeah,
conservative?
so that's where I'm, yeah.
So I get nervous about, doing an executive director's report, because that takes you some time.
It does.
And so, what's the return on investment? And
And I would agree, statistical data, you know,
Yes.
if there's something major that the public's gonna be aware of that we should probably know about, yes. But I mean, we're going through some things with like, we're maintenance and that's a whole probably another subject matter of how much do we get into that, but we're talking about staffing for that particular position, and it's like, I don't know that does that belong on that report?
I go back to, the purpose of the board is to manage the CEO, to manage the strategic plan, and to manage the board.
But that information helps us manage the CEO.
And what I would go back to is, what are your expectations for the CEO? And sometimes the question of financial management is in here. I rule that all into managing the CEO, because part of you doing managing the CEO is managing the budget and also managing operations. I don't like a separate, let's look at the numbers and let's look at the operations. I think those two have to be combined, or it gets just the
So you're saying
focus.
a lot of that might go to the CEO management committee, not to the board's office?
Correct. Correct. That would be a possibility. And I would tie it back to the expectations. And one of the challenges I would have is, if I ask every one of you to pull out a piece of paper now and write down the 4 or 5 primary expectations you have for the executive director, you have for the organization, how confident are you that you would all write down basically the same list? Bless you. You think you'd write down the same list? No, I'm nervous.
But we'd all be right.
Of course you would, but what the heck is she supposed to do?
I think
I've got a dozen board members who wrote down separate lists, and I'm supposed to read your minds and do them?
I think we'd be close. Maybe I'm naive.
But the fact you don't know tells me something.
I don't know definitely. If
I
I did, I'd go to Vegas, Dale.
Well, in my mind, this is where you ought to have a CEO management committee. They ought to be doing a better job of clarifying what those expectations are.
So you don't have yearly goals?
And if you have those expectations, that then tells me what data you need that supports accomplishment of those expectations. So if one of the expectations is to get, you know, more animals adopted per month, then data on number of animals adopted per month seems like a pretty important piece of data.
So you're saying if the director's report goes, let's say, to everyone, but the director management committee is to make use of it, other board members could email members of that committee. Is that what you're saying?
They
Are you going to do something about this? Are you concerned about that?
Well,
A lot
the
of
full
us-
board could do that at the closed session, but I really want to focus on keep making sure the board isn't getting into operational details, so that even the question, how many animals were adopted this month, the number is down. So what? I assume you're not working at the level of how many animals were adopted this month. You're working at the level of what are the policies and procedures and things that you do that motivate the adoption of animals? What are the publicity things you're doing? What are the ways that you motivate getting animals adopted? And the nuances of whether it's up or down this month is noise that's kind of irrelevant in my mind if I'm a board member. Because I assume you're up and down months because, I don't know, random stuff happens. It's just noise in the system. And I don't want to get into a discussion about noise in the system.
Back to the report, though, having the board know if someone gave a significant amount of money is useful information for the board.
Absolutely.
I think that you need to communicate that to the board in case the board members encounter that person somewhere in the street, that they can say thank you.
Well,
I would share with the board anything that, as a board member, it would be embarrassing to not know if a member of the community asked you about it.
Anything that is directly relevant to the mission that's important to us.
Directly relevant to the mission, but more that I mean, directly relevant to the mission, it becomes kind of a question of how fine-tuned.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in, we're going to put a new billboard up on the interstate, and even if that's not a board decision about what it says on the billboard, the board probably ought to see it before it goes up. Not for you to discuss it, not for you to comment on whether the font was right or not, but
Steve Jobs would disagree with you. They're going,
yeah, well, he's dead. But so that when one of your neighbors says something about the billboard, you go, no, I never saw it. I mean, that just doesn't.
And something like a bequest could, for example, go, I mean, we had one we just got, it went out in an email. I mean, because we were
Sure.
talking about what to do with it. So it could go there and then really not ever show up on the board, on an executive director
Right,
report.
and if it's a big enough deal, it might go as an email, just because I want to let everybody
Well,
know now
right. I
that
mean,
something
some of
happened,
that is
positively or
straightforward,
negatively. But the thing I keep coming back to is you want to protect from the natural inclination to get into operational details. And there is a natural inclination on the part of board members to get into operational details. That's just it's a gravity that you get sucked into it if you're not careful, because you care about the organization and you think about the details and you want to get into them. You're not going to have time to do strategic planning, to monitor if strategic planning is happening, to do your role in making strategic planning happen, to set expectations for the CEO, to assure performance relative to CEO, help with the development of the CEO. I come back to that one again, and do all the board management stuff if you also get involved in day-to-day operations. So you really got to keep, is this moving into the area of management of the CEO? That's why I got a little nervous about succession planning thing for the 3 folks that are senior management people. You have 1 employee, you got only 1. And that's it. And so the other people don't report to you.
I mean, if you had some expertise on the board that you wanted to tap into for that as advice, sure.
But, and let me talk about that for a minute. I'm a big fan of organizational committees that are not board committees. And let me draw a distinction. The Humane Society may have a committee on succession planning. The Humane Society may have a committee on buildings and grounds. May have a committee on pet food donations or all kinds of things. And if I can get 5 folks in the community, for example, who know something about buildings and grounds, a contractor, a landscape person, etc., who will all serve on my buildings and grounds committee and will give you free advice about how to manage the maintenance of the building, and they'll do it just because they think you're cool and because you put them on this maintenance committee and you buy them lunch every once in a while, and then you get free advice, I'm all in. Back to Evergreen, I served on their personnel committee. And I did everything for them I do for clients, with the exception of sending them a bill. Key distinction. Those committees report to the executive director, they don't report to the board. So I'm fine with a succession committee to help the executive director figure out how to manage succession. But that does not report to the board. That reports to the executive director. Distinction makes sense?
Yeah.
If it's an operation-related committee, great, fine, get free advice. Because otherwise you've got this weird thing of the succession planning committee is then reporting to the board on an operational thing. What just happened to your org structure? I mean, that kind of is around the executive director. Because it's ultimately her responsibility that succession happens properly.
And that's one of the issues that we probably should have some conversation about, right, is the interaction between the board and any staff members. We talk about only meeting monthly. The challenge with meeting monthly for an hour is that if you've got staff members who are involved in a particular project and you want them to kind of report to the board on, here's where we're going with this project, having a little longer meeting is better. You probably want staff members to at least know who the board members are.
We've been doing that.
That's good. That's good.
And they've been doing meet the board members.
Right. Yeah, but the rule is, our rules are, no board member can call a staff member. And in my mind, only staff need to understand that they show for a board meeting because the executive director asks them. Right, the board does not ask.
The board does not ask, the executive director asks because they work for. And it's an interesting question, what do you do with interactions with a staff person? Because it's, you could say they never call, okay, fine, but you're in the building for some other reason and a staff person says something to you. When I was on the Evergreen Retirement Communities Board, I'd be going through the facility and I'd talk to folks and they'd complain about, the beans didn't have enough salt on it or some damn thing. Well, what do I do with that?
Things have changed.
Oh, I know. You have done, this is why I can keep beating on Evergreen, because this was 25, 30 years ago?
30 years ago.
30, yeah, I'm old, 30 years ago. So, and it was a textbook example of a board that made huge evolutions in terms of responsibility. But that's when I was on the Armour School Board. What do I do with a parent who's complaining about some teacher? Well, yeah, I tell them go talk to the teacher, but do I then also communicate that to the superintendent? So if you do have an interaction with the staff, which can happen, then do you owe feedback on that to the executive director? Or not? How do you deal with that? And I'm not saying there is a right, here's the answer, write it down. I think
Say,
the
come
board.
out, where's the answer?
No. But I think it's one that the board management committee should gin up some conversation. How do we deal with that? How do you deal with something in the community? You're out in the community, you're known to be on the board of the Humane Society, and some person says, hey Bob, I hear the Humane Society, blah, 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 blah. How do you funnel that back to the executive director? How do you decide if it should go back? How do you decide if it goes back to the executive director? Does it go to the full board, and then from the board to the executive director? Do you call the board chair, and then the board chair sends it to the executive?
So it's appropriate for them to come in and meet us and do that, and how about we interviewing, or I guess coming into their territory during business
I think it's
hours?
wonderful. When I was president of the Onsboro School Board, I made a point of going and hanging in the teacher's lounge and et cetera, et cetera. But I tried to make exceedingly clear that I was there as only one board member. And as an individual board member, I have absolutely no power, no authority in this organization. If I can get 50% of the board members to vote with me, so I get 51%, now we can do a whole bunch of stuff. But as an individual board member, I got nothing.
So what
So
is your purpose then there?
let them see what I look like. And just build some confidence level between, I'm a teacher in the district, well, who are these people on the board? And the elementary teachers knew me because that's as old as my kids were, but the middle school and high school didn't. So, and build some of that relationship, et cetera. Showing an interest in.
That's one way to do it. Another way is to structure events for the board and staff to interact. That way it isn't just one board member being there, it's all the board members, and so the staff kind of get to know.
We try to do that when we have events here,
Yeah.
board members go.
Do any of you do volunteering in the organization? Well, now you're in the organization
Yeah.
as and this is where I think you've got to be schizophrenic. You've got to be willing to say, now I have on my volunteer hat, look, I'm not a board member now. I'm here cleaning out cages. I'm here doing whatever stuff I'm doing. And I encourage board members to volunteer. I think that's wonderful. But then they're a volunteer. They're not a board member. Because in that role, I'm not in charge of anything. I'm just here as a volunteer. And you got to make that clear to the other employees, because the employees will try and talk to you and gee, I think it'd be really great if we had X. And I've kind of asked the food chain, but the executive director said no. But man, if you could get the board to give us X, that'd be really cool.
I don't think that happens here.
No,
It
and I
just
have
does not
actually
happen.
consciously made an effort to say, hey, I'm here as a volunteer.
But if you don't do that, they will do, the staff will try to take advantage of board members as volunteers if they think it will be successful.
No.
If they think it will be successful, they will.
I don't think so.
Maybe
I-
organizations as a whole, maybe not
You-
this organization.
if they don't do that here, it's because they've learned it's not successful. If human nature being what it is, if I think I can get A, which I want, by doing B, I'm probably gonna do B. I mean, I'm not the guy with a psych degree in the room,
I
but
think we will face those challenges as transition with, when Joni's been here how many years? I mean,
22.
many more than us, so she's clearly
That's
the
gonna be-
authority, so.
Yeah.
But when that changes, that changes a lot of things.
And let me
You're
go
gonna have
back
deal
to-
with that.
Yeah.
to the other thing that this committee needs to do is development work with the executive director. Sitting down and having a conversation, said, look, you've been here 22 years. I'm not, there are age discrimination laws, and I'm certainly not encouraging you to go, but I'm guessing you're not gonna be here in another 20? I don't know what your plans are, and I'm not actually asking you, but let's assume it's less than 20. Well, what are you thinking in terms of time frame? Have you given thoughts to how we would manage transition? Would you be interested in a role in the organization other than full-time? Might there be some other role in the organization? How could that work? This committee needs to be ginning up that conversation and thinking about what that transition would look like. Would this be a time that you change the executive director responsibility? That, you know, executive director 2 may be different than the current executive director, and that you may divvy things up to some support staff in different ways. And do you want an executive director who's primarily an internal operations person, who's primarily an outside fundraising person? What do you want? The strategic plan may start to drive what you want out of an executive director. So that becomes, but my back is most boards don't do a good job of saying, where is it you want to be in 3 years and what can we do to help you? And any good supervisor should be asking subordinates, where do you want to be and what can we do to help?
We know exactly where Joni wants to be in 3 years. She wants to be distributing $1 million bequest that's unrestricted.
Well, if that's what your goal is, then that's
What are you
that.
talking about?
We got our work cut out.
You got your work.
Someone has to die.
But from a,
I don't think any of us here are volunteering for that.
and from a professional development perspective, you know, if you've got an executive director who's been here 22 years, the path may be pretty clear. But a few years from now, 5, 10, whatever the number is, and you've got a new executive director, what are their strengths? What are their limitations? What are they doing to help grow? You know, the coaching, the development, all the stuff that you ought to do with a direct report. My experience is boards don't tend to be particularly good at giving that kind of support to the executive director.
A couple things related to that. On one of the boards I'm on, we have someone who just left the board, but who is going to be the mentor and coach for the CEO. So that the coaching, because the CEO has some strengths, but there's some opportunities for development, and this CEO has seen the director in different roles and has some ideas on how to develop that. So that not so much for you, but for the future. The other is Bob Peters from Goodwill he's created this 5-year sort of succession out of the organization. Those, I'm sure you know Bob, and okay. So I think Bob had a really good conversation with the board and just said, here's where I want to be. And so this is a succession for him kind of moving out of the organization. He spends a couple months in Florida in January and February. He calls in on occasion, but now the staff have to make decisions without him. So it's a transition out.
And that can be very, very useful. Talk about managing the board. And this really has multiple components, and we've bounced into a number of these already. One is just, how often does the board meet? What should the board agendas look like? Development of the board agenda, being that filter for saying, should that really be on the board agenda? So the board committee, or the board management committee, could be the group that says, no, time out, we're getting into a discussion which...
That's the management police.
Yeah, and they sort of slap your own hand, but they're charged with thinking about what should be on the agenda, what shouldn't be on the agenda, etc. Very, very sort of important role in terms of managing what the board does. They could be thinking about the number of meetings. They're looking at the board members, and there's a lot of time that you really need to spend thinking about the members of the board. As I alluded to, I think you ought to go all the way back to how do you get new people on the board. And typically, what's the process by which someone comes onto the board?
They express interest, they apply, they are voted on at the annual meeting.
Okay.
There is no vetting, there is no matrix of skills needed. If very few people attend the annual meeting, the only way they would not get on the board is if the board itself votes them down.
And you had indicated express interest. Is this usually, I'm
There's
here?
an application.
Well, but is it typically they motivate, I'd like to be on your board? Or is it more often you reach out to them and ask them if they want to serve?
A lot of them on through leadership Oshkosh.
do think there is some, we have over time had some, you know, we would like some, well, Amy, you were, because we lost an
They need an
attorney,
attorney.
so we needed to locate an attorney. So we do, there are times when we
Thinking
will
about
look
roles
at
on the board, that's
who we
good.
need and what would be beneficial to
But it
get.
does make me nervous, given the size of the board, because if several people want to be on next year, and we need to replace Megan as a treasurer, the board is full.
Well, and one thing I would do is I would write bylaws that don't say the board is 12,
Right.
but says the board is 8 to 13, or
We
up
have
to.
10.
We have, this.
Okay.
And I would, most of the time, I would want to be under,
we are.
because I really like the concept